Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. O Allah, expand my chest. Make my task easier. Untie the knots in my tongue so that they may understand me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Haider Mehdi, and we are doing our weekly English program on verses from the Ascendant Quran and from the Seerah of the Prophet. And our guest today is Dr. Zafar Bangash, Director of the Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought, the publisher of the Ascendant Quran, translated by Imam Muhammad al-Asi, and the author of this wonderful, powerful book called The Power Manifestations of the Seerah. First time someone's ever written a book on the power aspect of the Prophet's Seerah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dr. Zafar Bangash, welcome to the program, sir.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My great pleasure to be with you, and my salams to all of your viewers and listeners as well.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you very much, Dr. Zafar Bangash. Dr. Zafar Bangash, I was going through your wonderful book again for the second time, The Power Manifestations of the Seerah. And it's amongst one of the most amazing books on the Prophet's life and the Seerah. And I was particularly struck by the chapter on the Charter of Medina, which is called, I think, the Misaq-e-Medina as well. Could you give us some context around that? And then I'd like to ask some specific questions about it. So,
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. What you refer to as the Charter of Medina, it's also referred to as the Covenant of Medina. And this was drawn up by the Prophet ﷺ very early on when he migrated from Mecca to Medina. It's important to give the context because that would then shed light on the situation in a better way. We need to keep in mind that when the Muslims migrated from Mecca to Medina, and the Muslims or the people of Medina, who are referred to as the Ansar, or the helpers of the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslims were still a minority in Medina. Or the two groups together, the Ansar and the Muhajirin, were still a minority because there were two major Arab tribes in Medina, the Aus and Khazraj, and then there were three Jewish tribes in Medina. Although they were not a majority, but they controlled Medina because they basically controlled Medina's commerce and trade and finances. This is not, I think people would be familiar with it if they reflect on it, that is unfortunately the situation throughout history. So when the Prophet ﷺ arrived in Medina, he decided to draw up a charter for the people of Medina, according to which they will conduct themselves. It's one of the most fascinating documents in the sense that the Prophet ﷺ outlined the rights and responsibilities of all the groups. But what he did was he put the Jewish tribes on par with the Muslims. Okay, he even put them above the non-Muslim Arab tribes. So in other words, the Prophet ﷺ considered the Jewish tribes and the Jews as the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, and he honored them and venerated them and extended them a hand of friendship. Regrettably, we know from prophetic history that the Jewish tribes repeatedly violated their covenant agreement. And of course, then they had to be dealt with accordingly. So the Covenant of Medina, which is essentially, I call it the first written constitution in the world, because prior to that, when in Mecca and Medina, there was actually no written document, no rules according to which they were governed. It was just customary law, and that was basically the stronger tribe would oppress the weaker tribe, etc. So what the Prophet ﷺ did was to give each tribe their responsibilities. And not only them, but their allies, because they were like being a tribal society, tribes had alliances with other tribes outside Medina. And so they were also included in this Charter of Medina. And this document actually is absolutely, incredible because it provides for not only the rights and obligations of all the constituent parts, but it, if adhered to, it would have ensured peace and security within the city-state of Medina. And of course, by and large, this document held up because the Prophet ﷺ was extremely fair in its application. And so in that sense, the Covenant of Medina is, I believe, one of the most important documents in prophetic history.
Perhaps even world history, because I've also observed in your book, The Power Manifestations of the Seerah, you've compared this document with modern constitutions, some unwritten, like common law in the UK, some written, like the United States Constitution, and some as prevails in the Arabian Peninsula, so erroneously and wrongly and incorrectly called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But I want to go back to the charter. You One of the fascinating things that the charter says, and this is completely unbelievable. We are talking 1400, 1500 years ago, that the prophet actually did not distinguish between any community based either on their religion or their ethnicity or any other bias, even Muslim, non-Muslim. How did that happen?
Okay, I think we need to understand a couple of things. In the Islamic State, the Prophet ﷺ was very clear that, first of all, there are Muslims, so Muslims have certain obligations, and then there are non-Muslims who are also members of that Islamic
Community.
state, in that Islamic state and community. They were actually considered Muslims not in the religious sense, but in the civic sense.
In the civic sense.
This is very important to keep in mind, that the Prophet ﷺ extended to them all of the civic rights, because obviously religious obligations are different from each community, and it was stipulated very clearly that every religious community, and of course there were primarily two religious communities, the Muslims and the Jews. There were a few Christians here and there, but they were very, very small numbers, so they didn't matter. But the Prophet ﷺ stipulated that every religious community would be free to practice their religion according to their laws and their principles. And they would be considered citizens of the state as well as Muslims in the civic sense. This was really in an incredibly sort of important thing.
Can I read out this paragraph that
Yes.
you wrote? It just the Covenant of Medina is a remarkable document full of clarity, fairness, and inclusiveness. It gives the same rights to all people, regardless of their religion, despite Islam being a universal deen and the Islamic State being an ideological fact of life. The reason I'm reading this out is that when Imran Khan in Pakistan talks about Riyasat-e-Medina, this is what he's talking about. The covenant emphasizes, by the way, the Imran Khan quote is not from your book. This is mine. I just want to make it clear. The covenant emphasizes common citizenship based on people's voluntary adherence to it. In it, you write, no reference, no favoritism or discrimination on the basis of race, color, tribe, class, or religion can be found, something sadly lacking in many societies even today. I mean, what a remarkable document, sir.
Absolutely. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution in 1776, they say we believe all men are created equal, etc., etc. But who they were referring to? They were not referring to all people. I mean, number one, they were talking about all men. So women were excluded from it. Number one, that is like 1776, and we had this Covenant of Medina was, as you said, 1500 years ago. So they excluded women from it. And number two, when they said all men are created equal, they are actually referring to those men that had properties, that had lands, that had slaves. The slaves had no right.
And were white.
And were white, exactly. So blacks were excluded. I mean, you wonder that, these people only 250 years ago were still excluding women, poor white people. this only applied to rich white people. And that was the American Constitution. And they say, well, we have the American Constitution. Of course, Trump is shredding that to pieces as well today, but that's a different issue. But we are saying that even the American Constitution, and we know that, slavery was, they had a civil war over slavery, and then the blacks didn't even have voting rights until 1960, the civil rights movement of 1964, 1965. Can you imagine? This only about 50 years ago, the blacks were given these rights. And the blacks were sent to wars to fight, to defend that America, but they had no rights to vote. I mean, this is the kind of incredible situation that existed in the United States only about 50 years ago. And you compare it with the Covenant of Medina, 1500 years ago, it drawn up. Subhanallah. I mean, any person with a little bit of fairness would see what a thoroughly brilliant and fair art document this is. It respects human dignity. It allows for everybody's fundamental rights. And throughout, those fundamental rights were never violated by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, there were, unfortunately, the Jewish tribes constantly violated their covenant agreements, but in terms of the Muslims, they always adhered to these rights.
So I want to now, thank you very much for that. So I want to now refer this to modern times. And there are two questions. One is the so-called incorrectly labeled Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which says the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a sovereign Arab Islamic state. This is from your book, by the way. With Islam as its religion, God's book and the Sunnah of his Prophet, God's praise and peace be upon him, are its constitution, meaning the Sunnah and the Quran. But under chapter 2, titled Monarchy, in Article 5, they write, the system of government in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. The rule is that it passes to the sons of the founding king, nobody else, Abdul Aziz ibn Abdul Rahman al Faisal al Saud, and to their children's children, and the most upright amongst them. But if they're all rascals, the least rascal amongst them is to receive allegiance by it in according with the principles of the Holy Quran and the traditions of the venerable Prophet, may peace be upon him. The king will choose the least rascal amongst them. I'm not quoting you. I will read straight from the book. The king chooses the heir apparent and relieves him of his other duties by royal order. And sir, and then you write, if God spoke and the Sunnah of his Prophet and God's praise and peace be upon it are his constitution, why is it called a kingdom? And why is the form of government a monarchy? I want you to dwell on that a bit.
Exactly. You see, first of all, in Islam, there is absolutely no permission for monarchy. I know that, after the Khulafa ar-Rashidun, monarchy came into the process, but that in no way justifies or in no way says that Islam permits that.
Hereditary monarchy, father to son to son.
Absolutely. You see, if you if we pay close attention, there was a time when a person came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he called him the Prince of the Arabs. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam admonished the man. He said, "Don't call me a prince. I'm a messenger and servant of Allah. I'm not a prince." So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually prohibited a person calling him a Prince of the Arabs. Number one. Secondly, after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see how the Khulafa ar-Rashidun conducted themselves. There was no hereditary sort of succession. It was by consent of the people, although there are differences of opinion, but we won't go into the details. But the fact is that the Khulafa ar-Rashidun did not declare themselves kings. They were not hereditary, and people gave their bay'ah, which is consent or allegiance, openly. So here you have the so-called the Saudi constitution, which was drawn up, by the way, in 1992, and they say that this is going to be a kingdom, and the king will appoint who is to succeed him. I mean, for God's sake, if this is according to the book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then I would like to know and ask of these rulers of the Arabian Peninsula, please quote me one ayat of the Quran that justifies your position. quote me one hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that would justify their position. So we see that these kinds of things, unfortunately, are constantly being pushed and justified because they want to basically
Just
keep
power politics. It's a
exactly
pure
smart. And
land grab, Kabza group.
and the other thing is that they have been installed in power by the British. There is documents available. I can give you references of so many
Oh, yeah,
books.
yeah, everyone knows that.
Everyone knows that. And then once after the Second World War, the British were eclipsed by the Americans. Then they became agents of the Americans, and they still are. I can just look at a week or 10 days ago, and Trump said he needs $1 trillion from the Saudi rulers, and they gave him $600 billion. They said we'll invest
No,
six
no.
hundred.
He said last time they gave me 500 billion, so I went there. Maybe now I'm going to ask them for 600 billion or more. They said, no, no, we will give you even more. We'll give you $1 trillion.
So imagine, look at that.
So,
And you compare that to how much money they've given to the Palestinians that are suffering Zionist brutality. Not a cent. Not a cent to the Palestinians. In fact, the Saudis have actually invested in a company with Trump's son-in-law, uh, something like $1.5 billion, and the Emiratis have done that, and the Qataris have done
this
that.
is Jared Kushner.
Jared Kushner, right? And this is invested in a company that has shares in another company, an Israeli company, that finances illegal Israeli settlements on the West Bank and the Golan Heights and other places. So imagine that they don't support the Palestinians, and yet they finance these illegal settlements in Israel on Palestinian land.
Excellent. So let's so clearly, according to every aspect of the Quran, of the prophetic Sunnah, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Sirah, this is the most un-Islamic state that is available in, because it actually openly violates all the edicts and the instructions and the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and the Prophet. So clearly this is not an Islamic country, Saudi Arabia. Last question. Imran's concept of Riyasat-e Medina, do you think when he says, and people obviously maybe don't understand, by my reading is that this is what he means, what we've just been discussing in the Covenant of Medina?
Absolutely. I think, when he talks about the Riyasat-e Medina, what we need to understand is in his last term as prime minister, what were the steps that he took, what were the policies that he implemented, and how he helped the ordinary people. I think the evidence is clear. Anybody with even a little bit of fairness would recognize that he established, for instance, the Sehat card. He established loans for students.
The Gharib Khana, sir, the place where people could go to sleep, get a warm food to eat.
Exactly. Like, I remember when I was a child or a young man, when I would sort of, of course, I only spent my time in Lawrence College, but we would travel occasionally from, let's say, our hometown to Peshawar or Rawalpindi. At that time, Islamabad wasn't developed yet, or Lahore. It was very difficult for people coming from outside. I mean, where would they go? Where would they sleep? Like, in Lahore, of course, at that time, he wasn't my father-in-law, my future father-in-law. They had a huge place in Lahore where they had their business as well, but there were also several rooms. So people who came from, let's say, our hometown, who would go there on business arrangements or whatever, they would at least have a place to sleep. Food. I mean, this is done on a personal basis, but this is something that Imran Khan obviously did a great service to the people of Pakistan by establishing these kinds of facilities. So even though he may not have established the ideal, Riyasat-e Medina, but he was working towards it. And I think
his basic principle was, it is to be a social welfare state. It has to provide equal rights for all as civic citizens, and irrespective of what religion you have, what ethnic background, what gender you have, what race, caste, color, irrespective of that, and you will be looked at. You are the responsibility of the state of Pakistan.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what he tried to do. I mean, in fact, if we look at it, even prior to him entering into politics, he had set up, the Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospitals, an absolutely remarkable contribution to, the health of the people, and also, the university that he established, Namal University. So we see that, his heart was and is in the right place. And he wants to serve the people of Pakistan, particularly the downtrodden. And that's, of course, what Islam is all about, that, you establish social justice in society.
Masha. And with this we end, and we hope people understand better what Imran Khan's concept of Riyasat Medina is. I strongly urge everyone to buy this book and read it. This is one of the most powerful books I have read on the prophetic seerah, by the way, and I've read quite a few, not as many as Dr. Zafar Bangash, but I've read quite a powerful book. And it's interesting how you have defined the articles of the Covenant of Medina, and they are 47 of them. I hope you can see them. They're 47. Beautiful, and then you define that, and then you also talk about the pacts with Aqaba, and you talk about the letters to various rulers and kings, and then you talk about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and you talk about the treaties with the tribes outside of Medina. It is a remarkable book, and the Abyssinian migration. I hope this is available in countries like Pakistan, Dr. Bangash.
Yes, it is.
Is it available at that famous book bank called Said Book Bank in Islamabad?
Not there, but if anybody is interested, they can contact us and we can direct them to where they can get a copy from, inshallah.
Okay, so if you can share the address after this, I can actually post it in the description so people can. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely, no problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Zafar Bangash. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and all your loved ones. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless the Muslim Ummah with courage to establish a just, socially just Islamic social order wherever they are. May they fight for the rights of the oppressed and the impoverished and those whose rights have been usurped in Pakistan, outside Pakistan, especially in Palestine. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum.